Welcome back to Inclusive Design 2025, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia. You can follow us on Mastodon and Blue Sky, and if you have any questions for the presenters, post them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can use the YouTube chat. We'll gather your questions for our Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. I'm honored to be joined by my guest host, Makoto Ueki. Makoto, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. Hello from Tokyo. Next, we have Matthew Hallonbacka and Elina Niemelä talking React Native, what accessibility professionals need to know. Over to you guys, Matthew and Elina.
Yes, thank you. So just give it a moment for the slides to be ready. Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you. So as you've possibly noticed already, I'm Matthew. Elina has worked extensively on preparing for this, but she's actually sick today. So I'm going to be presenting this on my own this morning. We are going to have a couple of clips of Elina actually taken from our rehearsal earlier in the week. So she is kind of here, but live, you've only got me today. That probably means that there's going to be a few moments where it seems like I might not quite fully know what I'm talking about. If you're anything like me, I mean, if you're autistic, then you probably are seriously muddled up by sudden unexpected changes of plan at the last minute. And that's where we are now. So Elina is a great colleague of mine. She's a mobile engineer. She's worked for just over 4 years now on our service called excluding, which is Finland's biggest grocery e-commerce service. They have a website and mobile app, and they deliver about 40,000 orders a week to customers all over Finland. They've got some really impressive stuff. They've got automated warehouses and that kind of thing. And some of the examples today are going to come from Elina's work there. Excluding exists inside. If you're in Finland, you will know this, but for everyone that's not, inside the S Group, which is a retail behemoth, frankly, huge organization operating about 2,000 points of business. We are actually a group of 19 local cooperatives owned by their members. If you've been to Finland, it's extremely likely you've been in at least one of our points of business, not just grocery stores, but also department stores, hotels, gas stations, even a bank. Operating in all those sectors puts the S Group very firmly in the scope of the European Accessibility Act. Especially, they've got a bunch of e-commerce services, and they've got at least 7, I think there's more, consumer-facing mobile apps. We build all our consumer-facing digital services almost in-house. And so for that reason, with the European Accessibility Act deadline approaching last year, they hired me to sit across our digital services and work on the digital accessibility there. I like to comment that I've been in and around the disabled community far longer than I've worked with technology, pretty much all my life in some form. And for the last 10 years, I've worked in software engineering. And once I started in that field, it didn't take very long for me to discover digital accessibility at the kind of intersection of those two worlds. Since 2020, so when the European Web Accessibility Directive was first coming into force for the public sector, I have specialized in digital accessibility. And last year, as I say, I joined the S Group, where I'm able to work on digital services that are used by the majority of the population of Finland. Finland, if you don't know it, looks a bit like this picture behind me. It's a lot of lakes, a lot of forests, that kind of thing. Tiny country in northeastern Europe. So today, I still say we, even though it's just me talking today, because you are going to see some of Elina soon. We are going to be talking about why a huge number of teams are choosing React Native, where this can make your work a bit harder if you are trying to build things that work for disabled users, and where you are actually risking creating real barriers. As one final disclaimer, when we were first rehearsing this, I kind of felt like Elina and I had a bit of a good cop, bad cop thing going on, because she's quite optimistic about React Native and I'm a bit more of a skeptic. So unfortunately, you're not going to get that balance today. You're mostly going to get what I say will be influenced by how I've come to feel about this. But let's get started with why so many teams have been choosing React Native, what makes it so popular. And I guess, first of all, because we've got a very diverse audience, let's start with what React Native actually is. So we're going to be talking specifically today about mobile apps. In theory, you can use React Native for other things. In production, I feel like that's less common. The most common use for React Native is to write some code and have it run on iOS and Android as a native application. So this is a tool made by Facebook. I'm probably going to jump between calling them Facebook and Meta today based on different things I've read, but when it came out, it was by Facebook. And it is a tool to write. The selling point is you write code once. And it came out 10 years ago in 2015 as an open source project. I believe it had been used internally at Facebook before that, but it was widely available about 10 years ago. In terms of how React Native considers accessibility and the needs of disabled users using apps as the end user. Already in the first version of React Native, there were some accessibility-related properties available, but this was heavily refined in 2018. In 2020, for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, Facebook took the GAD pledge and did a big blog post saying that they commit to making accessibility a core part of React Native. It had already been out for 5 years by this point. It was already widely used. I'll let you make your own judgment later about whether this was just performative or whether there actually is something to this. But it is, as I say, it is widely used. On the screen now, we've got a few icons of apps that do use React Native. We've got, for example, Meta's apps, Instagram and Facebook. We've got Microsoft apps, Outlook and Teams, that well-known bastion of usability. We've got some others. I think we've got Discord there. I don't recognize all of these. I do note that on the bottom line, we've got WordPress, Tesla, and Shopify, which are all interesting, each in their own ways. But the point is, there's a vast diversity of apps being built with React Native. And if you've used React, or frankly, if you've done anything on the web, you will find React Native pretty approachable. So on the screen, we've got a code snippet that's just supposed to highlight what kind of properties are available. And it looks a lot like HTML or JSX if you use React. So we've got an element, touchable opacity, which has got some attributes. And inside that element, we've got its child is a string, text string that says read more. But let's talk about the attributes we've got here for a minute. We've got accessibility label. This is more or less the equivalent of ARIA label on the web. It sets the accessible name of something. In this case, it's actually redundant. We've got it there just to demonstrate what it does, but it would be redundant because the child would present the accessible name if that wasn't there. We've got the accessibility hint, quite similar to what ARIA description would do if it was more widely supported, but or I guess ARIA described by, but then you've got to have another thing to reference. But we're passing in a string, and that is becoming the accessible description. And we've got accessibility role, again, the equivalent of role. Here it's link. So we take touchable opacity, which is a React Native specific concept, which behaves a bit like a button. It's something that is presented visibly to users. That's the opacity part, but it's touchable. So it interacts when people press down on it on the touchscreen. So we've got an on-press attribute there, exactly again like you could use in HTML. So when I started here, I hadn't done a lot with native mobile. I'd done a little bit of testing, but mostly I'd done stuff on the web and plenty of mobile web stuff, but never anything about these native apps you can actually install. But when I started looking at React Native, I felt like I can actually get a bit of a grasp of what's going on here. So surprisingly straightforward. But this still doesn't answer why it's popular. If we think about why it's popular, I think the key selling point, according to Meta, although here we've got a video that describes them as Facebook Presents, but it's on the Meta open source channel. I guess this is what happens when you change a big company's name like this. But here we've got a video, and the key quote from this, about 10 seconds into the video, is, if you know JavaScript, you can build native mobile apps. And a lot of people know JavaScript. The ubiquity of the web and of things like Node.js means that a lot of people learn JavaScript as their first programming language, and in some cases only know JavaScript. The idea of building something that runs natively on a device rather than a web app is appealing. A lot of users seem to like that. I don't fully understand why. I'm a big fan of the web, but a lot of people seem to like this. So being able to create a JavaScript app that runs inside the user's device while you, but runs without needing to be running inside a web browser, people like that. But this isn't the whole story. We live in a capitalist world, so the real argument here is aimed at business-focused people. If we were building apps the other way, so or not using any of these cross-platform frameworks, but if we were building apps specific to each platform, so one for iOS, one for Android, iOS with Swift, Android with Kotlin, so languages that the platform is expecting apps written in and can deal with apps written in, then those are more specialized skills. We don't have that massive number of people who know JavaScript that can do that. So those are far more narrow specialist kinds of skills. So to develop one for iOS and one for Android, you'd need two teams where the members have far more specialized skills. And if you're going to do a really good job, all the people in the team, the designers, the QA professionals, product people, they all need a good understanding specific to that platform. So you end up with two quite specialized, quite expensive teams. If you only care about your business's bottom line, or like if you're the accessibility person, probably your client does, then this React Native can appear as though with less money and only one team instead of two, we can actually build two apps. This is super appealing. The final reason that I think it has grown as become as widely used as it has is that this is all free and open source. It was originally, of course, built inside a big company, which means that it's got that little bit of trust. People are more inclined to trust something that's come from a big company than something made by a hobbyist in their bedroom. But so it's coming from a big company, but it's all open source. So you're free to audit the code yourself. You can decide what you want. You can look at the parts that interest you, make sense of what it's doing. When there are bugs, they only need fixing once, and they end up in every production application, React Native application that updates its version. And this is also really appealing for Meta themselves. They don't have to provide a warranty, and they get professional developers testing their stuff, writing bug reports, and in some cases, fixing the bugs or adding the features that they want. So it feels like a bit of a win-win situation here. We might come back to where this maybe falls apart later, but at a high level, win-win. So let's move on to where building apps this way can add some complexity. Now, on the screen, I've got a bit of a fun meme from a couple of years ago. This is the Square Hole Girl, I think it was called when it was a meme, but it's a side-by-side TikTok video. We've got the shape sorter toy, so a plastic bucket with various shaped holes in the lid, and we've got a woman on the left-hand side who just gets too far, sorry, who just gets more and more frustrated as this as the person putting them in puts them all in the square hole. Now, I realize that there's a bit of a metaphor here, not that everything fits in the square hole, but if we think about the interfaces that a smartphone gives us, kind of like this bucket, and there's holes you can fit through. So On iOS, you can, there's a Swift-shaped hole. If you write your app in Swift, it can run on iOS. But there's other holes. I think apps were written in Objective-C before that. When we say that you can write apps in JavaScript and they run everywhere, it sounds as though we mean that JavaScript can somehow be translated or compiled or something into something that the platform knows. That's not what's happening here. It's important to note that actually what's happening here is the app, the package of the app contains not only your code, but also an entire JavaScript runtime. There's a whole JavaScript engine there, effectively like a sandboxed runtime environment that it executes the JavaScript in. And that adds quite a layer of complexity because that JavaScript engine has been written separately for iOS and Android. It's using the same underlying primitive bits of code, but how it hooks into the operating system is different in each case. In a moment, I'll point out exactly where this can be a challenge, but it's easy to think of developing a new feature for an app as first you start with some designs, then someone writes some code, then you test it, make sure it's working, and it's done. This is, of course, a massive oversimplification, but let's run with this for a minute. This changes. Once you're using something like React Native, this changes. You can no longer think of these as the amount of work each of these represents changes a little bit. So let's start by talking about design. Users have expectations about their platform. If you take someone who's only used iOS for the last 10 years and drop an Android phone into their hand, they'll figure it out, but it will be unpleasant. The users have expectations about the platform they're used to using. And how we can take those expectations into account at the design stage, if we're building one app that needs to work on both platforms, we need to carefully consider, is anything we're doing here interfering with what users are expecting from the platform? Is it reinforcing those affordances, those expectations that users have? So design will take more work if you're trying to come up with something that works well enough on both platforms. Writing the code might not be a bigger task. It might be. React Native is very quick to point out if you look in the documentation, if you find a limitation of something that isn't implemented in React Native, it will point out that you can add in native platform code. So, for example, Kotlin or Swift. So writing code can take a lot longer if you actually do have to start doing things like this. But if you're doing something that's well supported by React Native, the amount of code you write is probably similar to if you were writing for another, if you were writing using the platform native tools. Where this becomes more work, and this is what I just hinted at in the last slide, is that you have to do a lot more testing to get this right. iOS, for example, has quite a homogeneous environment. All of the apps are running on quite similar hardware. At least we can have some certainty about the kinds of environments an app will be running. And even within the vast ecosystem that is Android, it is still less work to try and be sure that something works on a lot of Android devices compared to being sure that the same thing works on a lot of Android and iOS devices. When you look in, for example, the issues on GitHub, you'll find a lot of people offering workarounds and ways to fix a certain behavior on a certain platform. And when you do that, you can kind of get into a situation sometimes, and this isn't very common, but I've definitely seen it, where you add something, maybe like a containing element or some certain property or something to make something work somehow. And in doing so, you've actually now broken it on a totally different platform, maybe in a different place as well. And you get this whack-a-mole effect. We've got a picture from Wikipedia on the screen of the classic arcade game whack-a-mole, where something jumps up, and as you hit it, maybe two more jump up in different places. And it becomes an overwhelming amount of things popping up that you need to deal with. So I'm going to hand over to a recording of Elina now. Hopefully this all works. Elina's going to talk about her difficulties making certain things work with an external keyboard and how she worked around those.
So React Native and external keyboard. Both iOS and Android support connecting a Bluetooth keyboard. Switch inputs and other assistive hardware often emulate this keyboard behavior. And how keyboard works with web, it navigates through pressable elements with tab key and arrow keys. And works same with mobile applications. Though web has tab index to define tab key access, React Native doesn't have a similar kind of attributes. So this means that there needs to be another way. However, this is not documented clearly. So then I did my own testing for this. I started with a simple touchable opacity, which is similar to a button. I added a text by inside it and an on press event for the button. I started with testing keyboard access with this one, and it didn't work. Keyboard did not navigate to my button at all. So I extended. I tried adding accessible true and focusable true. In React Native documentation, accessible is defined as the property to define whether a component is accessible to assistive technologies. This could vaguely mean that it should work with keyboard navigation. However, as I tested, still does not work. And the last test I did is that I added accessibility role button, and now it worked.
That's wild to me, coming from the web, where changing the role, you're always drumming into people that just setting a role doesn't change the behavior.
Yes.
And here we have a platform that looks and feels like the web, or looks and feels like React, close enough, that where it actually does, setting the role actually does change the behavior.
Yes. And this kind of became my theory. The accessibility role is the one that defines whether it's accessible to screen, or no, not screen readers, whether it's accessible to external keyboards. So I further extended my testing. I took all the accessibility roles that React Native has to offer, which is nearly 30 different accessibility roles. And these are all from alerts, header, text, buttons, links, etc. There are many to use, but I chose only the ones that had a description that gave an implication that this element would have some sort of action, kind of like the button and link. So I chose all of those, and I tested and went through all of them to find whether my theory has consistency. And it didn't, surprisingly. There were 5 roles that had a description that kind of gave the idea that, okay, you can press these elements, that did not work with the external keyboard. So these were search, spin button, checkbox, radio, and tab. For the reason why those don't work, I don't know if it's a bug or whether it's just that there is no consistency. However, what I find complex about this is that I do understand now better how it works. However, I had to figure it out myself. So the documentation wasn't clear and didn't tell me this clearly. So I ended up in a situation where it's just figure it out yourself. And this, like Matthew said, the testing takes more time. This is exactly the situation where I had to test more, and it took more time to test and validate my theory of, does it actually work? Does the accessibility role really give external keyboard the access?
Okay, back to me for just a moment. So that is one example of where, even if the behavior does seem to be implemented how we would like it, the documentation just isn't there to make clear what we need to, or what we need to do as the people developing these apps. Let's move on to our final few examples now, and this is where using React Native as it comes can actually create barriers to our disabled users. And let's start again by handing over to Elina, this time to talk about the reading order.
So as a developer, there is one issue that I have really struggled with, and that is a screen reader reading order. Screen readers in general follow the reading order of top to bottom and left to right, same way as you would read any Western languages. Sometimes you might have some more complex elements in your UI that you might need to change the reading order for, just to make the context more clear and the experience a bit more understandable. So what my question has been is that how do I change the reading order with React Native? I have read this tip that just write the code in the correct order you want it to be read by the screen reader. And yes, this does work in web. However, it doesn't work when you're working with React Native. And yes, I have tried this multiple times with no success. React Native doesn't support the reading order based on the order you write the code in. And React Native doesn't support a way to change this reading order. And I will give you next an example of this. I looked through my own phone to look at other applications, specifically e-commerce applications, to look for this same kind of element that I've been struggling with. And I took some screenshots. The first screenshot is from Escapot application, which is the one that I work with. Second one is from Zalando app. Third is from Rituals. And the last image is from Vault application. And these are just the ones that I found with a quick scrolling through my own phone. All of this had a same kind of element in use. I will call it from now on a item carousel. This type of element was very much used to promote or bring up relevant products into users' view. And I have seen this type of element in many mobile applications as well as web applications. So in these item carousels, there are products shown in product card type of element. Each of these product cards contain image, product name, prices, buttons, and each of these cards are displayed in a horizontally scrolling list, so side by side. Now I will demonstrate what React Native does with this type of element to the screen reader reading order. My own test scenario is much more simplified version of item carousel, but that's only to kind of simplify the UI and simplify my points in what React Native does. For this test, I only used what React Native Core has to offer. And I started with creating a list of 3 example products: banana, milk, and bread. For the interface, I created a horizontal list of product cards. In each card, there is an image at the top. Below the image, there is product name, and below the product name, there is a buy button. After this, I moved on to setting my expectations of the reading order. My expectation was that it would start reading from the first card, image description. After that, it would move on to the product name, and after that, it would go to the buy button. So it would first read the first product card completely through before moving on to the next one. Why my expectations were like this is that this is the same order as I wrote the code with. Also, why I would want it to read it like this is that when screen reader moves on to the next element, the context doesn't change. So with this version, the context would always stay the same within the one product card, so one product. After reading the one product completely, the context would change to the next product. After setting my expectations and hopes for this, I started the actual testing. So the reading order didn't follow the same order as I wrote the code with, but it did start from the same element as I expected it to. So it did start from the first product card image description. However, after that, it did not move on inside the same product card, but it moved on to the next product card and read the image description from there. After that, it moved on to the third product card and read the image description from there. After reading all the image descriptions, it moved on from the last product card back to the first product card and read the product name. And with the same logic, it read all the product names from each card. And again, when getting to the last product card, it moved on back to the first one and started reading the buy button. And so on, read all the buy buttons from each card. Based on this example, React Native doesn't follow the same logic as web does, as write in the same order you want the screen reader to read it with. Also, React Native doesn't provide an easy way for changing the reading order, and this creates a barrier. One good thing is that since React Native community is large, in many cases, someone else has already bumped into the same issue as you have. Currently, there is an external library available that helps you to change the reading order with React Native. I have tried it and it works quite nicely and it's easy to use and works really nice with iOS. So change the reading order to whatever you want it to be. However, it still has some problems with Android. So Android doesn't yet work perfectly, but hopefully in the future, it will work with Android as well. Though, of course, my biggest hope as a developer would be that changing the reading order would be something that React Native Core would provide at some point.
Okay, so there's one example of a problem that we still have, that we still can't actually solve in a satisfactory way that ends up in our applications. The final example, I want to return to the fact that this is all open source software. Even though it's coming from a big company, we're not paying for a license, we're not getting any kind of enterprise support package, anything like that from Meta. We are just using something that's open source. And this comes down to the way that there is a culture of people contributing and sharing issues they found and that kind of stuff on GitHub. So I've got a screenshot here of a GitHub issue. In this issue, someone reports that there is a method available for detecting whether inverted colors is enabled. And it has the correct value in iOS, but it does not in Android. It could, perhaps in some cases, create a real accessibility barrier for people. If you've got something that, an interface element that you need to swap to something different while inverted colors is switched on, then you need to know if it's on or not. And the person reporting this, it turns out when I actually researched this, they actually do work for Facebook when they're writing this. But the person reporting this has even got details of how an application can query from the operating system whether this is on or not, and how they can do this. So this is all there. There seems to be everything we would need in an issue to understand what the problem is here and to potentially think about fixing it. Within a couple of weeks, someone else from Facebook has added the labels "good first issue" and "accessibility team evaluated." This seems to suggest, to me as an outsider, that someone who specializes in accessibility at Facebook has looked at this and agrees that there is an accessibility issue here. But good first issue seems to suggest that we hope someone else is going to fix this for us. Okay. A few days pass, and now someone comments, "Hey, I want to work on this," and asks for guidance on how to get started. And they're pointed in the direction of the how to contribute guidance. We actually don't hear from this person again. But over the next few years, we hear from maybe half a dozen, maybe more, other people who all say more or less the same thing. hey, I want to work on this, so I'm gonna expect a contribution from me. And this keeps happening, but there's no contributions. All of a sudden, at the end of last year, there is a pull request for someone who wants to contribute the fix, and within a day that has been reviewed, and within a week that has been merged. So Meta, Facebook, whoever's working on this behind the scenes are absolutely happy to get the code in, but they were never happy to actually prioritize fixing it. This waited for someone who wanted the fix to come in and fix it themselves. The challenge we have here is that this is not unique. At the time I was writing this a few weeks ago, there were 15 issues. The vast majority had this accessibility team evaluated label that, as I say, I interpret as meaning that we know about this and we agree that it should be fixed. But a good number also had labels like help wanted or a good first issue. So the subtext here certainly seems to be that we agree these things need fixing, we are not going to do it. Now, there's two possible reasons I can see for this. Maybe there's another I'm not thinking of, but mainly the reasons I can imagine for this are that this really complex setup of the app runs in a JavaScript environment that runs inside an app, and the app bundles a whole JavaScript runtime, a JavaScript engine, is making it so complicated that there isn't a good way to fix some of these. If it is, I'm dismayed that some of the biggest companies in the world seem to have gone all in on this, on React Native as their tool of choice. The other possibility is just pure ableism. The people working on this don't think this is important enough, this is impactful enough, or don't see the people who this affects as worthy of their attention. I suspect many issues are some combination of those two. I don't know. I don't see inside the discussions that people have behind the scenes. I don't see what goes on in people's heads. I can't say which issue this is, but we have a situation where there are issues that we have no way of fixing right now. So I'm going to start summarizing now. And again, I've learned Elina's parts yesterday. So let's see. So for developers, if you are a developer either working on React Native application or thinking about working on React Native application, what you need to know. First up, it is possible, as long as you stick within certain parameters, to create simple mobile applications using React Native, and they can be as accessible as apps built otherwise. React Native in and of itself does not mean that the accessibility has to be terrible, just that it's just that there are things we need to think about. Now, accessibility, making an app that does meet the needs of disabled users well, using React Native will take extra effort. This is not something like the old Accessibility Awareness Day blog post kind of suggested, where everything would be good out of the box. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But right now, there will be extra effort needed if you want to build a React Native app and you want it to not create accessibility barriers. As the app gets more complex, as you have more things involved, especially when you start bringing in native platform code, especially if you've not written it yourself, there may be times you have to make compromises. And when you're in a situation where you've already made these compromises, things kind of compound. We end up in a situation where we have a lot of issues that kind of cause side effects and all depend on each other and that kind of thing. We end up in a very tricky situation. From my point of view, as the accessibility professional who came into an organization that had already dived right in with React Native, what I would say you need to know if you're coming into an organization like that, or if your organization are thinking about building their first app, for both some technical people, but especially for the people who control the budgets, the appeal of write code once and it will run on both platforms is extremely strong. You will find it very hard to gently nudge back against that. Doing it this way, though, will create extra work, especially for testing. And when you are trying to figure out accessibility issues in a platform that behaves quite differently on different platforms, you are going to have extra challenges here. You have to be aware that you can't rely on accessibility issues being handled with urgency or fixed by Meta. Some things do get fixed, but in general, stuff seems to sit in this backlog. The oldest item in the backlog I showed a screenshot of a moment ago was, I think, 2017, so 8 years ago. You can contribute your own fixes if you want, but if you've gone all in on React Native and you've only hired people who know JavaScript, then if this is something that touches the native platform code, then they won't be able to do that. But if you are coming into a company that has already gone all in on React Native, I would say don't panic. There are plenty of good things you can do, plenty of impacts you can make, and plenty of workarounds you can find. It is not perfect. If you are looking for a framework now, I would suggest exercising extreme caution before considering React Native. But in general, if you're already there, it is possible to be okay that way. So that is what we had. I'm happy to take questions that I know the answer to now, bearing in mind I am not the mobile developer, but I think Elina is hoping to keep an eye on the YouTube comments later. So if there is anything technical, hopefully she can address that. But thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. It was a great and interesting, if slightly depressing, talk about the state of React. Makoto, do we have any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experiences. We've learned basics for building apps accessibly by using React Native. We've got a question from the YouTube chat. What resources have you found most useful in learning how to implement accessible React Native apps?
So from my point of view, this is going to be a bit of a non-answer. Maybe, again, as I just mentioned, hopefully Elina can have a look in the chat when she's feeling better as well. But I found this to be quite a challenge because the actual information is quite limited. Even React Native's own documentation is missing some important information. So I've actually found that just being willing to tweak things, test things, tweak things, test things is actually the more reliable way to figure this stuff out. But of course, when you're doing that, you have no guarantees about how things will work. So you have to keep redoing that test every time something changes. And while it is possible to write some good automated tests for mobile apps, it is not, what can I say? It is difficult to test some accessibility specific concerns with automated testing. So we end up in a situation where the only thing we can do is keep doing layer after layer of manual testing. I have found that you have to be testing things yourself, and I have not found one. There are websites that I can't remember now, and maybe I can post some in the chat later that give good examples, but there is no like encyclopedia of all React Native accessibility stuff. If there was, my job would be, and Elina's job, our jobs would be a lot easier.
Thank you so much. I do understand the situation. I've also got a question for you. My current company is using Flutter, developed by Google, which is very similar to React Native. As you know, Flutter is also the framework for cross-platform development. My question is, what are the differences, pros and cons, between React Native and Flutter in terms of inclusive and accessible design development?
Again, I'm not going to be able to give this a very good answer. I don't know Flutter very well. Mm-hmm. I looked very briefly at some examples with it, and immediately, even in the most textbook, I mean, I think it was a while ago, I was testing some I don't want to misspeak here. Let me think. So I did test like a very basic like demo app that was made with Flutter, and I did have immediately only tested iOS voiceover and immediately had problems and convinced myself quickly that, well, this is certainly no better than React Native. So left it at that. I've only worked, before I worked here, I mostly only worked on the web. Since I've worked here, I do some stuff with web, some stuff with React Native. We do have one team who build with Swift and Kotlin as well. But I haven't gone deep into Flutter because we haven't been making a choice about technology. So I can't give you a very good answer there, but from what I have heard, there are similar limitations with any cross-platform framework at the moment.
Thanks so much. Could you tell us what kind of cases you would not recommend to use React Native, if any? In other words, do you always recommend React Native for any kinds of cross-platform development?
Okay, I would actually go a step back, and I would say, why is cross-platform development the requirement here? I have yet to see a convincing argument that cross-platform development is usually the right solution. If your needs are very simple, if you are using only things that React Native supports out of the box, then you might be okay with React Native. But to be clear, I do not recommend React Native for most purposes. Okay. You might be okay with it, and if you are in a company that is already using it, it does not make sense to rip everything out immediately and start over. But if someone came to me today and was asking about building a new app, I would say you need to exercise extreme caution before choosing React Native. It might be okay, but so I want to be very clear that I'm not recommending it in a lot of cases. However, I think as interfaces, as apps get more complex, the possible benefit of using that kind of approach starts to be outweighed by the complexity of maintaining it in a way that works for multiple platforms. So I think that for me, if someone had a very simple requirement, like a quite simple app, then perhaps I would be okay if they wanted to use React Native. But it's kind of a trick question. If someone asks which cross-platform framework should I use, it's like, well, ideally none of them. Ideally, you wouldn't need I feel like the only arguments for cross-platform development right now are like capitalist type, we have to save money type arguments, rather than there's actually a good technical need for doing it that way. And I hope that it will be nice in the future if there is one perfect way to do this on multiple platforms. And if React Native, as they've said, is their wish, can turn into that, that will be great. But right now, I do not think that React Native is the solution to every problem, let's say.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthew. We don't see any other question on the social medias at this moment. So, but more people will watch your presentation afterwards. It's midnight in North America and early in the morning in Europe. So please check hashtag ID24 for next few days. That's it. That's all from me. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Makoto, and thank you very much, Matthew. So if you like this session, please hit the YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to our channel to be kept in the loop on our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia, our Silver supporters, Intuit, and our Bronze supporters, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Mantis & Co, and Vispero. We will be back on the hour with our next session. See you then.